The flashing blue lights of 3 police boats were reflecting off the water, creating a chaotic disco ball effect on the hull of my grandfather's vintage canoe, and all I could think about was that my coffee was getting cold. Karen Sterling, the president of the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, was standing on the shoreline screaming that I was a domestic terrorist, her voice cracking with a hysteria that felt rehearsed, while a terrified young deputy had his hand resting nervously on his holster, shouting at me to step away from the weaponized body of water. I looked down at my mug, then back at the officer, and realized that to these people, silence was aggression and ownership was a threat. But what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly understand as she waved her frantic little violation papers in the air, was that I had spent the entire previous night reading a dusty, leather-bound legislative document from 1892. In exactly 30 seconds, when I pulled the deed out of my flannel shirt pocket, Karen Sterling was going to find out that she hadn't just called the cops on a retiree, she had called the police on a federally protected commercial waterway, and the recoil was going to be absolutely spectacular. Let's rewind 72 hours, back to when I was just Arthur Vance, a 55-year-old structural engineer who had spent 3 decades building skyscrapers in Chicago and just wanted to retire somewhere where the only elevator I had to deal with was the emotional kind. When I found the listing for Mirror Lake outside of Asheville, North Carolina, it felt like fate. A distress sale for a 1950s cabin on 3 acres, including a 12-acre private lake. The kind of place where the silence is so heavy it feels like a blanket. I bought it cash, unseen, ignoring the distressed part of the listing because I was too focused on the way the sunlight hit the water, but I should have asked why the previous owner, a sweet old lady named Mrs. Abernathy, had fled to a nursing home in Florida. I was unloading my truck, soaking in the mountain air, when a white Mercedes G-Wagon pulled into my driveway sideways, blocking me in with the entitlement of a feudal lord, and out stepped Karen, a woman whose smile was all teeth and no warmth, wearing a blazer that cost more than my first car. She introduced herself as the guardian of community standards, and the moment she looked at my canoe, I saw a flicker of disgust that told me everything I needed to know. She started rattling off violations before I'd even unpacked my toothbrush, telling me that the dock needed a permit, the canoe was an aesthetic blight, and that the lake, my lake, smelled like unauthorized biological activity, which is HOA speak for fish, actual living nature. She handed me a card for Brock Higgins, her preferred environmental compliance officer, and told me he'd be by to inspect my water quality, her tone suggesting that if I didn't comply, the water wouldn't be the only thing getting tested. That night, I called Mrs. Abernathy, and her voice trembled over the phone line as she told me about the fines, the relentless testing fees, the accusations that she was poisoning the neighborhood children with her lake water, a campaign of psychological warfare that broke her bank account and her spirit. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived slapping me with $2,500 in fines for unauthorized aquatic storage and environmental negligence, demanding payment in 48 hours, and when I checked my security cameras, I saw Brock Higgins sneaking onto my dock at 3 a.m., pouring something into sample vials and photographing my property like a creeping voyeur. That was the moment the switch flipped, the moment the tired engineer died and the angry strategist was born. So I went to the Buncombe County Courthouse and dug into the archives until my fingers were gray with dust. The clerk, a sharp-eyed woman named Patty, helped me pull the original territorial maps, and there it was, clear as day, a designation from the late 19th century marking Mirror Lake as a federal navigable waterway, under the jurisdiction of the Army Corps of Engineers, granting the owner, me, exclusive riparian rights that superseded any local municipal code, let alone a power-tripping HOA board. I walked out of that courthouse feeling like I was carrying a loaded gun made of paper, the autumn air tasting like justice. But Karen wasn't done. She was just getting started. The next morning, the sound of a chainsaw ripped me from sleep, a violent mechanical scream that sent me sprinting barefoot onto the lawn, where I found Brock and a crew of guys hacking away at the massive, 80-year-old weeping willow that shaded my dock. I screamed at them to stop, but Brock didn't even look up, just kept cutting while Karen stood by with a clipboard, smugly informing me that the tree was a safety hazard according to an emergency vote taken while I was asleep. I called the Buncombe County Sheriff, but the dispatcher gave me this civil dispute runaround, and by the time I hung up, the tree was gone, its massive trunk crashing into the water, sending a shockwave across the glass-like surface that felt like a physical blow to my chest. That evening, Karen handed me a bill for $4,500 for the tree removal, claiming the trunk was 6 inches over the property line. But while she was lecturing me about community canopy standards, I noticed Brock down by the water, filling vials right where the tree had crashed, creating a cloud of sediment and debris. The trap snapped shut in my mind. They create the mess, call it contamination, and then charge me to clean it up, a perfect circle of fraud. I called my contact at the FBI, a relentless investigator named Special Agent Reynolds who I'd worked with on a fraud case back in my construction days, and told her they were manufacturing environmental evidence. But she told me that without proof of intent, it was just a neighbor dispute. I remembered my grandfather's old advice about water tables and dragged his vintage, but accurate, chemical testing kit out of the garage, sneaking down to the water at midnight like a cat burglar in my own backyard. I took samples upstream, downstream, and right at the crash site, and the chemistry didn't lie. The tannins were high from the fresh wood, but the water was non-toxic, pristine, utterly safe. I emailed the time-stamped results to Reynolds, proving that any report showing toxicity would be a fabrication, and when Brock showed up the next day with his official testing gear, which looked suspiciously like a pool maintenance kit from Walmart, I was ready. I walked up to him, camera rolling, and asked him for his EPA certification number, a simple question that hit him like a taser. He froze, stuttered, sweat beading on his forehead as he tried to mumble about working through third-party labs. But when I pressed him, asking for the lab's name and accreditation, he packed up his gear faster than a magician hiding a failed trick and bolted. That afternoon, the resistance began, starting with a text from Chloe, the owner of a local Pilates studio, telling me that 5 other neighbors were ready to talk, ready to fight, and that Karen had made a mistake by targeting someone who had nothing left to lose but time. We met in the back room of Chloe's studio, the air smelling of lavender and fear, a ragtag group of suburban refugees huddled together like we were planning a coup. There was Stanley, a retired forensic accountant who looked like a stiff breeze would knock him over, but had eyes like a hawk. Mitch, a landscape architect whose business had been blacklisted by the board, and Sarah, a young teacher who had been fined into debt for having a non-compliant vegetable garden. Stanley laid it out, his voice a dry whisper, telling us he had hacked into the Pine Ridge financial records before Karen changed the passwords, revealing a hemorrhage of money. Over $60,000 in 2 years, funneled to shell companies registered to Brock Higgins. Stanley showed us the pattern. Small fines escalating to liens, liens escalating to foreclosure threats, and then the forced sale to anonymous LLCs that bought the homes for pennies on the dollar. Mitch spoke up, his hands shaking, saying Karen had threatened to ruin his reputation if he didn't give her kickbacks on community contracts. And suddenly the picture zoomed out. This wasn't just about a grumpy neighbor. This was a racketeering enterprise disguised as a suburban government. We were deep in the planning phase when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop the meeting or the fire department gets a call about commercial zoning violations. And when we looked out the window, Brock's distinct black pickup truck was idling across the street. Lights off, engine humming like a waiting predator. They were watching us, tracking us, and the realization that we were under surveillance turned the situation from a legal battle into a cold war. The next morning, I woke up to 0 water pressure. And when I went outside, I found my main water line had been surgically cut with a sawzall, a clean, professional severing, with a bright orange tag zip-tied to the pipe claiming environmental contamination risk, service suspended. I called the county water board, and they had no record of the shutoff, meaning Brock or his goons had committed felony infrastructure tampering just to dehydrate me into submission. While I was filing a report with a sympathetic deputy named Officer Davis, Mitch's house, 3 streets over, erupted in flames. I drove over to find Mitch standing in his driveway, watching his garage and his work truck, his entire livelihood, burned to the ground, the heat searing our faces while he clutched his phone, showing me a voicemail from Karen timestamped 20 minutes before the fire started, calmly explaining that his contract was terminated due to unreliability. Agent Reynolds arrived as the embers were cooling, her face grim as she noted the burn patterns that screamed arson, confirming that we were no longer dealing with fraud, but with domestic terrorism designed to silence witnesses. But Karen was playing 4D chess while we were playing checkers. I got back to Mirror Lake to find the entire shoreline plastered with official-looking biohazard, quarantine zone signs issued by the Buncombe County Environmental Health Department. A man in a uniform, holding a clipboard thick with data, told me my lake tested positive for E. coli levels that would kill a horse, presenting me with a binder of evidence that looked terrifyingly legitimate. I felt the walls closing in, the sheer weight of their fabricated reality threatening to crush me, until I took a closer look at the official county seal on the documents and noticed the Latin motto was misspelled, a tiny crack in their armor. I rushed my grandfather's original samples to the University of North Carolina labs, paying for a rush analysis, and the professor, Dr. Eris Thorne, confirmed that my water was pristine, proving the county report was a forgery. But before I could celebrate, Stanley called me in a panic, saying the IRS had just frozen his assets based on an anonymous tip about money laundering. They were systematically dismantling us, hitting us with the full weight of bureaucracy, weaponizing the government against the people it was supposed to protect. I was sitting in the charred remains of my boathouse, which they had tried to torch the night before, sifting through the wet ash, when I found the old filing cabinet shielded by a fallen beam, protecting the one thing that could save us. The original 1892 land patent with the embossed federal seal. I read the fine print by flashlight, my heart hammering against my ribs, realizing the text explicitly forbade local encumbrance, seizure, or quarantine without a federal court order. I called Stanley to meet me at a diner on the highway, far from Karen's spies, and he brought the final piece of the puzzle, the deed transfers for 17 other properties in the county, all sold to different LLCs that traced back to a single holding company owned by Karen Sterling and Brock Higgins. They had flipped $15 million worth of real estate by terrorizing the elderly and the vulnerable, literally killing people with stress to steal their equity. We weren't just saving a lake anymore. We were stopping a serial killer of communities. The final morning broke with the roar of heavy machinery, a sound that vibrates in your teeth, and I looked out to see Brock operating a massive yellow excavator, digging a trench from the road toward my shoreline, aiming to breach the natural berm and drain Mirror Lake into the municipal storm sewers. A county supervisor, who I later learned was Karen's brother-in-law, was directing traffic, waving a forged emergency drainage order, claiming that contaminated water had to be purged immediately to save the neighborhood. I grabbed my surveying transit, a high-precision tool from my skyscraper days, and ran toward the machine, shooting the coordinates as I ran, realizing Brock was digging exactly 47 feet inside the federal boundary line. I stood in front of the bucket, screaming that he was destroying federal infrastructure, but he just revved the engine, the black smoke choking the air, a maniacal grin on his face as the bucket swung dangerously close to my head. Suddenly, the cavalry arrived, not in the form of local deputies, but in unmarked black SUVs that tore across the grass, led by Agent Reynolds and a tactical team from the EPA Criminal Investigation Division. They swarmed the site, weapons drawn, shouting federal orders, but the local sheriff arrived simultaneously, creating a tense Mexican standoff between federal agents and county police, guns drawn, jurisdiction clashing over a pile of mud. Reynolds handed the sheriff a phone with a federal prosecutor on the line, and I watched the color drain from the sheriff's face as he was told that interfering would result in an obstruction of justice charge that would end his career. The sheriff ordered his men to stand down, and that's when Brock, realizing the game was up, panicked. He swung the excavator arm toward the federal agents in a last-ditch attempt to escape or destroy the evidence. The sound of metal screeching against the earth was deafening as the marshals moved in, tackling him out of the cab, slamming him into the mud while he screamed about his rights. A pitiful end for a man who had terrorized grandmothers for a living. But the real show was Karen. A news crew from Channel 5 had been tipped off by Chloe, and they were rolling live when Karen pulled up in her white SUV, expecting to see my lake drained and my spirit broken. Instead, she stepped out into a swarm of federal agents. The reporter, a sharp woman named Jessica, shoved a microphone in her face, asking her about the forged environmental reports and the 17 families she had defrauded. Karen tried to run, actually attempted to sprint across the lawn in her heels, slipping on the wet grass and face-planting right next to my canoe. a moment of slapstick justice that felt like a hug from the universe. The emergency HOA meeting that night was standing room only, the air electric with the kind of energy you usually only see at revolutions. Stanley projected the bank records onto the wall, showing every stolen dollar, every fake invoice, silencing the few Karen loyalists who tried to shout him down. When Agent Reynolds walked in and announced the federal charges, RICO, wire fraud, environmental terrorism, the room erupted, not with anger, but with the relief of hostages finally being liberated. We voted the entire board out by unanimous decision, and I watched Mrs. Abernathy, who had moved back in with her daughter, weep openly as the tyranny of Pine Ridge Estates was dissolved. 6 months later, the silence has returned to Mirror Lake, but it's a different kind of silence now. It's peaceful, not oppressive. Karen is serving 7 years in federal prison, and Brock is looking at a decade, while the assets seized from their fraudulent LLCs are being redistributed to the victims. We turn the community around. Stanley is the new treasurer, running the books with transparent honesty, and Mitch has replanted the willow tree, a sapling that will one day shade the water again. I sit on my dock now, coffee in hand, watching the mist rise off the water that is legally, federally, and morally mine, and I think about the thin line between civilization and savagery. We like to think that laws and rules protect us, but the truth is, the only thing that protects us is our willingness to read the fine print and stand in front of the bulldozer. It makes you wonder, though, how many other Karens are out there, running their little fiefdoms, destroying lives one violation notice at a time, just waiting for someone to finally say no? Is there a tyrant in your neighborhood waiting for a revolution? Maybe it's time you checked your own deed. You might be sitting on more power than you think.
Alright, and that is for today's videos. I hope you enjoyed it and found something useful. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe and share it with your friends. Let me know your thoughts in the comment below. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.